Welcome, everyone, to the Masculine Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This podcast is a conversation about how men show up in the world and how they can do that in a healthier way. And today is proof of the fact that we cannot show up in our best version of ourselves as men without friends like my friend Esther. When I started Epic, she was a lead. She had been a leader in this work for a long time. She became a mentor to me in my early days at Epic. And really her wisdom helped shape a lot of what we do and how we do it at Epic. And she has become one of my oldest friends in this work. This is Esther Garrett. I'm very excited to welcome you, Esther. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. Besides being a friend and grateful friend, I would say, of yours, Tom. A little bit about me. Let's see. I am a native Oregonian. Other than some short stints out of the state for college and career, I have lived here most all of my life. I am a mother to a child. We have a large blended family. We've got 7 kids total, a large age range there, and also at different times would be home to numerous foster kids. So a lot of kids under our roof, which I absolutely love. That's probably the number one thing I'd say about me. I love horses. Horseback riding is my free time, being out hiking in nature. And if you live in Oregon, you're probably in the best place on earth to be. I'm biased, but So that's a little bit about me. And then I, in terms of career, I've been an advocate now, a crime victims advocate by certification for more than 20 years. And yeah, that's me.
So that being an advocate, crime victims advocate, that started before you got involved in the anti-human trafficking movement, right? It started in the domestic violence arena. What was that? What was the nature of that work when you started?
Yeah, it's like sexual and domestic violence. So I knew I already wanted to be a victims advocate while I was in college. I'd seen a little clip in the newspaper and I thought, that's it. That's what I want to do. But it was like on the back burner while I was in college. And then as I was getting close to the end, you had to do like a volunteer hours thing. And so I found a local rape crisis center and I actually went through the process to become a certified victims advocate for a rape crisis center to do their emergency response to the emergency rooms for people who are coming in for like a forensic kit to be done if they've been sexually assaulted. So I volunteered in that capacity for a couple years and then ultimately went to work for that team. And it was under the umbrella of a larger crisis response organization that did like all kinds of crisis response, numerous crisis hotlines, domestic violence hotline, sexual assault hotline, drug and alcohol abuse, like mental health, all of that kind of came under one roof. And it exposed me to a lot of different kinds of advocacy. And I really began to find my niche. And looking back, it was like the beginning, like cornerstone, I think, of my career and education exposure to the field. But it was definitely rooted in serving all kinds of domestic and sexual assault survivors.
You've been doing this for so long. Do you remember maybe earlier in your career what it was like for you? Because I've never done this, and I think I don't know a lot of men that have had this kind of, I don't call it an excruciating privilege, but to stand with a victim of some kind of sexual violence in that moment of crisis. Like, what is that like for you? Or what was it like for you when you first started? Because like I said, you've been doing this for a long time, but like emotionally, how do you navigate that personally? That I can't imagine how difficult that would be.
Yeah. I mean, I feel really grateful that I learned in an environment that the unfortunate side of that coin was, the sexual violence rate and the reporting rate as well in the state of Nevada was where I was first beginning my career, was extremely high per capita. Like, I think at that year, it was like 9 times higher than the rest of the country. And I don't know where it ranks this year, but it was very high. And so there was unfortunately, a lot of opportunity for learning. It was a very diverse experience, which really educated me. I really appreciate that. But I think going out the gate, I was mostly afraid. And I think a lot of people are when they engage in loving people in any capacity. I mean, this is like a big life thing. But like when you engage with people who are hurting, you're afraid the wrong thing. You're afraid you won't know what to say. You're afraid you won't be equipped. And you're afraid of what will happen and what your response will be. And so training can help equip people, but I think that's like the universal thing of like, what are we getting ourselves into when we open-heartedly like love people in their worst moments? And so early on, that was my fear. And we can talk a lot about that because there's a lot you can unpackage there. But I immediately learned upon my very first call out, I would say even, how just getting out of our own way and showing up and being present and allowing ourselves to feel the magnitude of people's pain with them, you don't solve people's struggles anyway. And so the best thing you can do to honor them is to really bear witness and to honor who they are in the moment and their experience. It's really not about us at all.
Is it as simple, not simple, is it as just straightforward as just being like physically present, even if you don't like say something? As a guy, like I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes. I know I'm wired to want to immediately fix something. And obviously there's something broken in the world when people have to go through that kind of violence. So when you show up, like how did you, so you said the fear is a big thing. How did you learn to overcome or manage or navigate that fear in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was immediately awestruck and humbled by the experience of when you're faced with someone else's like probably worst moment. There's like I don't know how else to experience this without talking about it through spiritual language, which is my own, and I realize not everybody's, but the closest that I can say to experiencing God in the world is bearing witness to other people's pain when you're staying out of your own way to not make it about you, because the opportunity you have to love someone, and I call it being a reflective mirror, but what you can reflectively mirror back to people about themselves in terrible times is a huge privilege, but also it's so hope inspiring because who people are in the aftermath of very difficult things is a testament to their own strength, their own survival skill, their own intrinsic worth, their own adaptivity, their own creativity. And so all you have to do is reflect what's already happening to people. And that is enough. And not pretend you have to like have the words, because that's very much about like me and my human finite capacity. Just reflection. And that was always enough. I always felt like those moments were like the eye of a hurricane.
And that's really good. Yeah.
I'm in the eye of a hurricane right now because there's so much going on. But in this moment, you are still who you are. And that's enough to do one more moment. And one more moment.
And okay, so what you're describing, if I'm understanding it right, what you're describing is what advocacy is.
Yes.
In many ways, right? That's the core of it. I know there's a lot of other things, but is that a fair
That's a fair statement. Yep.
Picture? Yeah. So what else is involved then in advocacy? So you're there with them in the eye of the hurricane, but what else is involved in advocacy, the work that you guys do?
There are pieces that education really like we are there to provide information and resources, because I think another inherent privilege to being a helper is that you're more educated about systems and navigating them than people who aren't used to having to do that. And certainly people whose brains are in crisis, right? So just being able to say, oh, did you know that actually you have these like rights afforded you by law, and they might actually open these doors? You don't have to pursue them, but they could open them if you wanted to. And here's what that might look like. So people could think about their options. I mean, you don't have options you don't know you have. They'll become real choices if you don't know you have them. Right. And so a lot of it's information and resource sharing, safety planning, and we use different modalities for that, but really helping people walk through the exploration of their own ideas about where they want to go and why.
Can you say a little bit more about safety planning? I think that's a real helpful distinction there too, because you're not there rescuing someone.
No.
in that sense. So can you explain what safety planning means?
I mean, I tend to bristle at the word rescue simply because I think it takes the power out of the person who's navigating it themselves, their own crisis, and it puts it in the hands of the other person who supposedly is going to swoop in and theoretically maybe have some power to solve it for someone else, which is the absolute opposite of what advocacy is, which is really like, how can I amplify your strengths and bring to bear resources around you, and then maybe talk through like facilitated conversation around how to get you and your strengths connected to the resources that are there in a way that feels right to you, so you can begin to
in your time.
Yes. And the safety planning piece is just thinking about things that when people's brains are in crisis tend to be maybe not all readily accessible. Like, let's take a moment and think about what your support system looks like. And do you want to stay connected to it, or do they actually pose you threats that maybe would be worth thinking about right now? What about your online footprint? Is that somewhere you want to spend time right now? Or does that create an exposure to unsafe people that you might want to take a break? Like, just working through like every piece of their life to be like, what do they want to choose to engage in and what don't they? But always giving them the power of choice along the way, so they feel like I made this plan for me. And also I'm capable of making plans, because sometimes they've been coming out of situations where they have not been told that they're capable for long, maybe ever.
Do you find that sometimes the folks that you work with, they may talk to you about a safety plan and all that, but they don't act on it? And like that must, and I know this is true, I mean, that must be hard because sometimes they'll return to their exploiter, right? I mean,
all the time.
How often does that happen with a victim of this kind of violence? And typically, how often do they return to the source of their violence and exploitation before they finally have the wherewithal to make that final break?
Yeah. I mean, I would say almost always at least once. Like, every now and then I meet someone who I met them on the day where it was but they'd already done the pre-work probably internally and mentally and emotionally. And I just happened to meet them at the time where that was the moment, right? Of exit, never look back. Like, but that's really rare. I feel like for the most part, everybody is sort of cycling through a process of like attempt, try it out for size. What works for me, what doesn't. Also, it's very difficult to try totally new things in unfamiliar territory, looking over your shoulder at like, what is going to pop up? Is this person going to be stalking me? Like, is it even worth it to try to leave right now? Or is that actually less safe, which is statistically actually true? Danger increases when people try to leave. And so, I mean, I can only really reflect back on this really specific level, like through my own lens of my own personal life experience. But I would say coming to terms with I'm in a relationship with someone who's not safe for me is a difficult road of living without avoidance long enough to really come to terms with like letting hope die, because we're built to be, like, we're wired to be hopeful creatures. It helps us survive. And we tend to believe the best about other people. And so if you're a well-meaning person going into building a relationship with someone and you have good intentions, it's easy to attribute those to the people around you. And you can be very intelligent and even understand the dynamics of domestic violence and still think, this can't be that. Or maybe this will be explainable. Like, it takes numerous cycles of the cycle of violence to get to the point of like, oh, that's what this is. And it keeps happening. And because it's a cycle, right? It's a circle, not a linear line. It's going to keep happening, and coming to terms with like that. And also it's not going to change is a process of grief. Like, you have to grieve it enough to accept that. And that's just a process. And it's very normal. It's very human. And I think sometimes we pathologize that, but it's very normal.
Yeah. And an advocate then, if I'm understanding it, is a person, and advocacy is a system that keeps showing up in that cycle.
Yes.
Maybe like a fixed reference point, right? Like there's Esther again. She's reminding me of the fact that I have agency and I ignored her last time. Maybe I won't this time. Yeah. So this pattern, this dynamic is the same in domestic violence, right? Yes. I mean, so is domestic violence, what's the connection between domestic violence and sexual exploitation, sex trafficking?
Yeah.
What's the connection there?
Great question. So I would say not all domestic violence is commercial sexual exploitation, right?
Right.
Some domestic violence, there's all kinds of different forms of violence, right? Spiritual abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, right? Like, there's all kinds of aspects. If you've looked at the wheel of violence, and I've never looked at that wheel that's out there, but not all forms of DV have commercialized elements of sexual abuse in them. Many of them do, but not all, right? But if you look at basically all dynamics of sex trafficking, where there's what you might call like a Romeo trafficker involved, which is by far the majority.
Boyfriend.
Yeah, right. Those virtually all have domestic violence in them, because that dynamic is virtually always sexualized in a Romeo trafficker dynamic. And because the environment is so inherently power-based for the person who's trafficking and lack of power-based for the person that's for sale, it is inherently abusive and exploitative, which by definition is domestic violence. If there's a sexual intimate relationship and that person is experiencing the financial abuse, which they are, the physical abuse, which they often are, right? The sexual abuse, which they almost always are, right? It does meet the definition. So, and I think that if we accepted that as true, I think it can challenge a lot of what we see statistically about domestic violence, about what we noted as domestic violence related homicide. Like our statistics would be drastically changed on a national level if we looked at that differently.
Yeah. As you're unpacking this, I'm reminded of a moment early when I was first getting to know you, and we sat down and you were talking about commercial sexual exploitation. I think at the time we were both on the Multnomah County Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children Task Force.
Yep.
And I was very new, and I don't remember what precipitated the conversation, but I was asking you about, okay, what is sex trafficking? And you, just like you did now, with great precision, you just unpacked the details of what sexual exploitation was. And I remember, I don't honestly remember if I said this. No, I did say it out loud. I said, so what you're telling me is men are paying to rape vulnerable people, and primarily men are benefiting from the transaction. And you nodded and smiled slightly like a good teacher who just realized that her student finally got it. But I mean, it's that simple.
It is.
And yet it's so, I think that's the thing, is I've been in it for so long and trying to combat this issue, the dynamic of what is actually happening, what's creating the violence and the trauma and all of that is a very simple, transactional, hellish thing. It's pretty straightforward, but the impact on the people, the trauma, that is so layered and nuanced, and it can take a lifetime to unwrap. We may come back to that, but now tell us about what you're doing right here, right now with Safety Compass, which is you guys have been one of our closest partners for a long time, but tell us what Safety Compass does, because it's really an extension of who you are and the work you've been doing for a long time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can't tell a story without a little bit of the origin story. Back to when we first met, I was managing a unit of advocates, which was the first in Oregon that I'm aware of. I mean, honestly, it might have been at the time, one of the first in the country to do that particular thing, which was we had a group of nonprofits. So in confidential, in Oregon, it means we have actual legal privilege. We can't be subpoenaed, but we're very separate from the criminal justice system, right? But we have these nonprofit advocates, and we were collaborating with the Portland Police Bureau. We had taken what was their drugs and DVD street team, and we had separated it. So there was actually a human trafficking unit within the Portland Police Bureau. We started partnering with local child welfare, homeless youth continuum, support services for the housing piece, and really bringing in this trauma-informed piece, which was the victims advocates, to go out on the track missions, to do coordinated, targeted stings to help interrupt what was happening to children and learn more about how we could be supportive. And so out of that really sprung to life the Portland sort of collaborative process, which didn't really exist before that, with total deference and respect to other previous iterations, right? In the 90s, there was the Lotus Project, and there was a lot of pioneering work done in Portland, early 90s.
Yeah.
But really since then, there hadn't been a really coordinated effort of any kind. And so, but what I found in doing that work in Portland was okay, we started this really beautiful, genuinely collaborative model between advocates and law enforcement, child welfare, homeless youth, but that was starting to really change prosecution rates of traffickers. It really revolutionized how we served the survivors, because we stopped looking at them through the lens of criminality and said,
right,
oh, these people have experienced abuse, they need victim services, right? So that was great and all, but I looked right outside of the Portland metro area into the more rural communities, which is where I grew up, And I was like, why are those kids still getting like literally arrested for prostitution? And they're like 15-year-old kids. Like, that's not what we're doing here. And so I really founded Safety Compass originally to both respond to that issue by taking that model that we had just built in Portland and extending it outside of the city to maybe pull my life story full circle. I think in some ways I just felt really like indebted in my own life to my community and wanted to do more for them. But as I did that, I realized like the gaps that were persistent were numerous. One was I felt like the domestic and sexual violence movement had, for some reason, a long way to go in acknowledging that human trafficking was inherently a part of the service population they were already working with, right? So the people that were coming in for DV services oftentimes were trafficked, but they weren't being seen for that piece of it. The survivors
and they probably didn't see themselves as being trafficked, right?
Correct, right. And so it was like the part that nobody would talk about. But also, if you can't talk about something, I question like how much can you heal from it? And so I was challenging the DVSA movement, and I say that really with a lot of respect because they are what built what we know of now as best practices in so many ways, right? But there were gaps, and so what started out as a pilot, which I thought was going to be sort of self-sufficient in an awareness campaign and then close, I really felt like there were persistent gaps. And so we just kept saying, we don't want to duplicate service, but we'll stay as long as there's a gap. And then from that, it just grew. It built from one county to another county. So at this point, we're a regional effort, but it didn't start out with that mission. It started out just to fill a gap and challenge the domestic and sexual violence movement.
Help me understand what it's like. You mentioned a call out earlier, just to paint a fuller picture of the nature of this work. So give us a scenario of a call out and what does that look like? Because it speaks to something else I want to talk a little bit about. But
So I built our model off of basically when I say trauma-informed care, I mean understanding this particular kind of trauma and then building a response that actually literally responds to that kind of trauma, right? So what we know about brain development, without getting way off in the weeds there, is that for people who experience complex trauma, they live through a very sophisticated combination of avoidance, minimization, self-reliance, right? These things tend to become elevated in their life because they're just chronically exposed, right? And this is true for domestic and sexual violence survivors who were unable to escape their perpetrators, true for people who've been trafficked. But what I found is that people who had exposure to systems had windows of opportunity, usually right after what we might call like a precipitating event, a trauma of some kind, where they were momentarily not living in the same kind of avoidance. They were confronted with what just happened. But then over time, as their brain comes down from that adrenaline, their coping strategies pop back up, which is just to carry on and probably become more self-reliant and more distrusting of people and systems and adults and more avoidant of the kind of gravity just to survive. It's like a really incredible coping strategy, really. But we had this window and I didn't want to miss it to engage with people in a way that kind of confronts all the messages of the sex industry, which is you're not a human. You don't matter, right? You're invisible to the rest of the world. And so we built a strategy to say, let's show up as fast as we can in that window to be the reflecting mirror, right? The people who say you are worthy, you are smart, like you do actually, you're doing a lot already. You are the navigator of your life. And like, how can we make sure that those rights are being protected? And you can speak about this and people will believe you. Don't have to speak about it, but you can if you want to, and we will affirm you. And so our response team is 24/7. We will be anywhere in that region within 1 hour of the request, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to do that piece, be that like I in the hurricane, and do the safety praying. And then that's just the beginning because we do numerous other phased services after that. But that window of opportunity is something that's very special and we want to capitalize on it for people.
That's a pretty thoughtful response to this trauma. But you didn't just come up with that and then put an ad up somewhere that says, hey, Safety Compass is available for 24-hour crisis response. It took some work to get law enforcement to trust you. How did that happen?
I laugh at the story because, I mean, it's been 20 years of the story. So it's like, I don't even know where to begin with the story. I would say I very early on, where do I even begin with the story? I very early on saw that there was some not only good reasons why people were wary of maybe new folks that they hadn't worked with before, new style, new partners of different kinds.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to be arrogant to that fact. Like, I really wanted to be like, you might have some good reasons why you're not trusting. Also, you care deeply and passionately about your job as a police officer or as a child welfare worker. You probably are leveraging your own expertise in this moment, and you are protective. You don't want this to go wrong for the person because you actually care about them too, right? So I wanted to come in with a lot of humility, but I also was like, there's some things about trauma that I don't think we're getting here as a system, and really honoring people's agency and choice. And so I'm not going away. And basically, I'm going to be your friend eventually, whether you like it or not. This is a war of attrition, and I'm going to win because I'm stubborn enough.
And I'll keep showing up.
Yeah. And I think there was, I can't remember one call in particular where I was working with one sergeant, I'll just say.
So wait, to be clear, the call out comes from law enforcement. They identify a potential victim. Yes. Okay, so go ahead.
I was just saying, it doesn't always have to come from law enforcement, but that's one of our number one referral sources, right? It could come from an emergency room or something. But so law enforcement called us out. And I'm out there with a person who hadn't really worked with us much before. They have this minor who they think's being trafficked. They also think ran away from home because they're abused in the home. And some other ingredients like that are what they believe to be true based on past history and reports. But this person's not talking. This kid's not talking to them. And they were trying like the power approach of like, we can get you to talk to us because we have power and that will intimidate you. And I say that with a lot of care because I think that was an old school way of doing it. And we thought that worked. And you don't know till, and then when you do know, you can do better. And so I came in and waited for my opportunity, which was not with them. We always collaborate now. Advocates and law enforcement do interviews together, which is by far the best practice. It's more successful, everything. But at the time we didn't do them together. So I waited for my turn. And in talking to this youth, they certainly didn't have to disclose to me. The story could have easily been like, I talked to them, they said, thanks or no thanks, and I went about my way because they would have the right to do that. But they just happened to actually want to talk to this person who was confidential. And so they ended up disclosing, but then once they did, they ended up feeling like, that wasn't so bad, and that you respected me, you believed me. And so they actually wanted to talk to the police after that, which, again, you can't really make that up because I would never have, wanted. I never made them, right? It was just like up to them, and they actually wanted to. Right. So I think that.
But you were there, yeah.
And so
what does disclosing mean?
Just telling their trauma story, telling the pieces of things about the abuse that maybe they have not yet felt comfortable sharing.
Got it.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after these messages. Did you know we have a new show? Join us in listening to Shop Talk, an extension of the Masculine Wilderness podcast, where your host, Tom Perez, and me, your producer, Lauren Trantham, get together to talk about the behind-the-scenes action that goes on within the anti-trafficking movement, current events, and epic news. It's free to subscribe. Just head on over to our website at epicproject.org and sign up for our newsletter, and you will be automatically opted in to receive these private episodes. See you at Shop Talk. And now, back to the show.
That image, that picture that you painted of what that call out looks like is very different than what I call the action hero narrative, where you bust down the door, you beat the crap out of the bad guy, and you rescue the vulnerable kid. And that's such, especially among men, that's such a compelling narrative. What you described intellectually makes a whole lot of sense. But I'll be honest, emotionally for men, the action here, like that's the guy we want to be. What advice would you give to men that feel that tension? It's like, why is, maybe another way to ask it, why is that action hero idea of busting down doors, why is that actually not all that useful? What would you say to that?
I have so many things to say.
I know you do. That's why I asked.
I think I'd start with the question. I would ask people to reflect on their own life. Was there ever a time where you maybe shared some vulnerable moment or thing, or were seen through a maybe a moment of weakness or a lens of like lack of capability. And then someone came along and either was your champion or encouraged you, or somehow their presence made you feel like you could try through your vulnerability and maybe risk not succeeding. But like those moments of realization of like, oh, I can do this, usually come after going out on a limb and trying to do something, which means when we try something, we don't know if we're going to succeed or not. It's a moment of vulnerability. And usually the people I think that make us feel like it's worth trying, they're not doing it for us, but they're also not taking that moment away from us. And I just ask people to reflect about what would feel right for themselves, or if they've ever been in that situation, what helped. And it's not other people coming in to swoop in and save the day and then be like the champion of our story. It's often a person who believed in us, and maybe part of the story is that encouraged us, but they're not there to be the savior of the day. Like that's like our hard work when we're going through hard things, our bravery when we hope to try new things, or through vulnerability where we risk failing. Like the more that we can accept our own power and ability and bravery, and like that's what ultimately will serve us in the future. It's not the dependence on this other person. And so I guess partly it's just like, what would you want to happen for you,
That's
right?
So good.
And do that for other people.
Yeah, it can't be that simple. That actually is very wise. I mean, you've been doing this for so long, and I know you live and breathe this, and it is second nature to you. Do you ever have moments knowing the risks and having seen all the violence? Do you find does the mom part of you well up and go, I want to protect you? You like, do you still feel that in those moments?
Every now and then, but I also think that caring enough to worry about people that's also human. And I think that there's this thing that happens when you demonstrate and you gain credibility through the repeated demonstration of like, I am not here to control you. Like, and we can go through things and you might make choices that you probably know are different than I might make in this moment, and I still don't control you. Like you gain credibility of like why you're really there. And honestly, we all have to demonstrate, like it makes sense they don't trust us, right? Like look at the lives of the people that are typically trafficked, especially when we meet them, have been trafficked sometimes for a long time. Of course we need to demonstrate credibility. But I think down the road, when I can say now, like, hey, I'm just checking in because I'm worried about you, because I care about you, that is something different than like, hey, what choice you're making, and here's the choice I'd make. And maybe in this moment, like that's just a totally different approach. When kids know they're loved, and that's the lead, it's not about control. I think love can really create a latitude within it, but you have to be authentic in that being the driving force.
When you said love, I was just thinking about like how you show up in the eye of the hurricane, and like just that kind of presence with a person who's going through something so difficult. It really feels like you guys are demonstrating what you and I have learned from our church background. That's unconditional love. It's like, hey, I'm here. And I'll be here, and you may walk away, but I'll be here when you decide to walk back. And there's just such a beautiful tenacity to that approach.
Well, and if you think about like the idea of unconditional love, especially for a kid who maybe has never experienced that modeled in their life, it doesn't mean anything until it actually happens. And so I always feel so much more useful when kids have left or they've run away 14 million times, and then they come back and you get to actually be like, we're not rehashing that. We're not like, we're in this moment believing in you. Like grace is action. like it is not just sitting there. It's like, it's just like so about the present moment and moving forward. It's so not about like looking backward for kids. And I feel so privileged that ongoing advocacy that does more than just the crisis intervention piece gets to do that because people do cycle, right? We get to keep showing up, and it's more powerful probably every time.
This doesn't just come out in the way you engage with survivors of exploitation. It comes out in the way you engage with partners and friends. I mean, I've been the beneficiary of that. I have my own theories, but I would like to hear your thoughts on why, because you've been doing this a long time. Why is friendship in this work? Why are healthy relationships so critical to staying in this struggle? Why do you think that it is necessary?
I can say very simply, we can't do it and sustain ourselves without it, but there's a lot more to it than that. I think partly why the anti-trafficking movement has been so, I don't want to use the word alluring, but I don't know what else to say. It has drawn a lot of people to it in a way that weirdly, maybe unfortunately, the domestic and sexual violence movement never did in quite the same like universal way. But I think that something about it is it's so overt and it so draws in upon like our universal challenges as humans to feel like unlovable, to feel maybe not part of the community, to wonder if we're good enough, to need unconditional love, to like a lot of what happens in the anti-trafficking space is themes that like everybody needs to resolve. It's like the human experience. And so I think because that a lot of people have found a way in, but because it also plays upon these universal themes, I think it also just models a lot of life in general to me. I don't know if that makes sense, but like we can't sustain ourselves in life without long, healthy relationships, right? We don't thrive in life without them. And we definitely aren't going to thrive in a highly traumatic space. But, you know, life is highly traumatic for a lot of people. We live in a very privileged place, you know, in our relative safety and relative ivory towers here in the United States. But there's a lot of hurt in the world. And even in privileged societies, there's a lot of emotional hurt and lack of connection, right? So to sustain that at all, we need deep connection. And maybe never is there anywhere more obvious than the anti-trafficking movement because it's just so bleak. But it's the same themes, right? And so when you look at what trauma does to people, we all have experienced vicarious trauma in this field to varying degrees. Some of us have experienced primary traumas and then complex traumas, and then we show up as people with lived experience and then do this work, and then we're traumatized more, right? So there's many layers of trauma going on. And what that does to us, like on a physiological level, like our nervous systems are very adaptive, which is great. But one of the many things that it does on a maybe a maladaptive level is that we start to see threats as amplified. My notifications are on, but we see threats more readily and it helps us survive. But the problem is it can really wreak havoc on our relationships. And so I think people who are doing anti-violence work we're in traumatized structures. We're individuals operating traumatized structures that because we've absorbed and institutionalized vicarious trauma, we tend to break down relationships, but it will not sustain us. It won't sustain us on an individual level. It will not sustain us on a systemic level. Our structures will crumble. And then not only are we not serving people, but like what about our own hearts, right? And so there's just literally no other way. And again, I say that with a lot of humility. It's not that I'm coming untraumatized. It's not that I'm not experiencing vicarious trauma, but I think we just have to have not only grace for ourselves and each other, but like a really like direct confrontation of that. There is no other way than to have and try to maintain friendships.
Can you give us just a brief description of vicarious trauma?
So proximity to people who are experiencing trauma on a nervous system level, because I won't go deep into the brain, right? But we are exposed to each other's nervous systems and we're responsive to each other's nervous systems. And so when you're working closely with traumatized people, our nervous systems become impacted by that, but also just hearing stories, listening, engaging on a heart level with people who are hurting can obviously deeply impact our hearts. And sometimes like the passive exposure. What I mean by that is like, I can't do anything about it. I hear a story and then I leave and I don't get to engage with it in a way that makes me feel like I'm helping or part of the solution. Is actually sometimes more traumatizing psychologically. And so all of us who are leaning into this work, and honestly, all of us who, like I said before, are leaning in for each other anywhere, run the risk of experiencing that kind of trauma through the witnessing of other people's trauma. And it's, again, we don't need to pathologize it. It doesn't mean that we're wrong. And it's evidence that we're open-hearted, which I would argue is right.
Right.
But we have to acknowledge its impact on us. Otherwise, we can get really unhealthy.
Yeah. You are responsible for teaching me that, I think, for the very first time that I can remember years ago when we both shared office space in the same building in that church in Portland. And you had asked us for help with a gal who had executed her safety plan and was trying to get out of town. And we had helped with some transportation, but you brought her to my office. And because she had heard that I was a pastor and wanted me to pray for you. Remember that?
Yeah, I do,
and you
very
guys
well.
Walked in, and I don't remember what the prayer was. It felt really lame and inadequate at the time. But what I remember two things. I remember seeing her, it was summer. She was wearing this like a sundress with a bare shoulder. And I remember seeing a bruise on her shoulder the size of my hand. And I have big claws. And it was so obvious to me. I remembered that you guys left and I went out into the stairwell. And the second thing I remember is I sobbed.
Yeah.
And it was like, it was just like you said, I saw what had happened. And even though actually we had the privilege of being able to do something to help, I knew that it was also representative of so many victims that are at the moment beyond our help.
Right.
So that was, and I think you were the first, and we may have talked about it afterwards, but I think you were really the first person to say, you got to pay attention to this effect on you.
Yeah.
And I did then, I don't do it anymore, but I did then what I was conditioned as a man to do in this culture. I was like, yeah, I'm fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
But it's not. I don't operate that way anymore. But it's because of your friendship and leadership. I want to circle back to the friendship part of it. Yeah, well, it's been a long time. What have you learned about how men and women can function, not just as colleagues, and you do that well, you do that among some of the manliest men in the male population, with cops and detectives and all of that. But like, what has all of this taught you about what healthy friendships look like with men? Is that even possible?
Well, I mean, first thing I would say is yes, I do 100% believe it's possible. And I think it's the same things I think about men and women. And I say that almost like a little in air quotes, right? Because I'm really generalizing groups of people here. But you could also say it's like, again, going back to like universal themes in life, it's like the same things that I believe will sustain men and women really being friends are the same things that can sustain all of us. Like, and it does go back to humility. I think not assuming I know someone else's journey, but also believing the best in like, sometimes we don't know how to relate to each other. And that's probably sometimes just because we literally don't know. we need more information. And I think a lot of times people are doing the best they can. They just maybe don't have the information. And then sometimes when they do have the information and they still don't act it, there's like a lot that goes into why. Like there's just so much that I don't know or have empathy for that's not my story. And I hope that people have that for me, because I certainly have my own story. Yeah. And so I partly also, I think I got an interesting growing up experience in that, like, my dad was this stereotypical, like, cowboy who went off to Vietnam and was living a life in the aftermath of that life, right? A cowboy who went to Vietnam. And that was my dad. And then my mom was this hippie from the beach in California. And so those two people are my like growing experiences was with them. And I really like have deep, genuine appreciation and love for people who have very diverse background experiences. And so when I think about men and women, the archetypes of things you might think there, like diverse experiences don't have to mean inherently like an inability to connect or respect each other. Differences don't have to mean anything negative. Different belief systems even, and we have so much to learn from each other. Like so much we can learn from each other. And I think that I need compassion from people who don't believe like me, who don't really understand me, but who give me compassion anyway. Like that's very healing. And similarly, I hope that I can extend that to other people. And so I think that those things are playing out between men and women a lot. And especially in a society where there is so much history of patriarchy and hurt, for men to come in with that humility and be okay not being known and still show up anyway and be also willing to be like, I didn't know, but now I do. And so I'm going to try to like stumble through it. And for women to be like, I can appreciate that you're showing up vulnerably, like in a space where you know there's hurt, you're showing up anyway because you want to do it better. And that I don't have to understand you or necessarily know you to have a lot of compassion for that vulnerability. And those two things, I think, together create at least a good start.
That describes in so many ways our connection over the years. And really, and like I said at the beginning, you really helped shape how we do the work we do. It's because you brought that and held that space for us. Because I can remember feeling many times early on, and I think some of our other guys feel the same way, like we're here, we have no clue what to do. Or the way you described showing up with a victim, like we show up going, I'm afraid to say anything. Maybe I should just, I think this was good advice for me early on, but just shut up and listen, kind of how my parents taught me. And I think for men, that's oftentimes that's a really helpful thing. Just shut up and listen.
Yeah, but I also feel like it's worth saying back to that though. And again, this is now I'm being your reflective mirror, Tom. Sorry, not sorry. I think it's worth saying back to that I don't know that you're giving yourself enough credit in the moment that to do that and from that posture, it requires a lot of desire for better over protection of ego.
Yes.
The ability to be like, I don't know, but I'm going to learn, which also puts me in the position of maybe I'm going to get it wrong. And I'm going to be willing to get it wrong and then have to bear the responsibility of that, then not engage at all. And that actually is evidence of me trying to be the man that I actually do respect, like the idea of that man, more so than the man who stands there strong with his arms crossed and acts like he's got it all together. And so I think that there is a lot to say for you all's posture that I learned a lot from, that I deeply respect. And that has also taught me, like it's not a one-way street there, taught me a lot about how to show up in spaces for humility, because we all do. That's not just a gender thing. Like that's all of us.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of the most beautiful ironies that I have seen in the anti-trafficking movement is in this space that's full of so much sexual violence and trauma. Like that's the thing that we're dealing with. So often I have seen deep friendships flourish between men and women. Yeah. And I think where that exists, real progress, real forward progress is being made. And that's not just Epic and Safety Compass. I've seen it in dozens of other places, but where men and women can learn to work together in the way that you're describing and in the way that we've taught each other, I think that's where real progress can be made. So I just think the irony of this thing that's so sexually charged is a place where actual authentic friendship between men and women can flourish. It's crazy. That's just crazy.
Maybe brighter, maybe it might shine brighter there than anywhere because of the backdrop, actually. But I totally agree with you.
Yeah, that's so cool. So 20 plus years now you've been at this.
That's wild to think about, but more than 20.
What, aside from a house full of kids, like what is life-giving for you?
Horseback riding. Horseback riding for me is, horses are very emotionally intelligent creatures, and they also are prey animals in the wild. And so their responses to their whole world are actually fight or flight responses. And so I think that they taught me how to be a good advocate before I even knew, because I grew up with horses.
Really?
But they also reflect that back to me. And so I feel like I just communicate with them, sometimes probably better than people, but I love being able to just be around them, grooming them, riding them, whatever. But that and like hiking with my husband, I feel very grateful to be able to be in this beautiful place. But nature is so evident, like, of what's alive and beautiful. And like, that's the other thing too. It's like the sex industry it can consume those of us who are doing this work. And for people that are in it, it feels like it's the whole universe, right? But there's so much beauty in the world if we can just like pick our heads up. And some of us don't have as much access to that as others. I want to acknowledge that all the time whenever I talk about this. But I feel very grateful that I can. And that really does heal, like that helps heal me, I think, is to stay connected to that there is beauty in the world.
Yeah, that's so helpful. It is our custom to give our guests the last word. So I want to ask you, my mentor and friend. I mean, you gave a good one there with talking about beauty, but is there anything else by way of encouragement that you would offer selfishly to men, especially, if I could ask on behalf of men?
Sure. Gosh, the pressure's on. Yeah, I feel like I've had a wild ride of a career in that being on the front line with all these different police departments and different stings and working cases all over the country. It's like, I don't want people that listen to that and think, well, I don't get to do that. Maybe I'm not a police officer, or I don't do sting operations, or maybe I am, but like, whatever. I want every man to be able to hear, hopefully, this conversation say, I have a sphere of influence and I have many opportunities in those relationships to be more present, be more connected, and really figure out how to be a person of influence for health, for respect, for equality. I can impact the men around me in terms of their ability to be vulnerable. But there's so many opportunities for influence. Also, life is hard at times. Every person, I believe, will be the eye of the hurricane at different times of their life for different people. So be open to being molded and equipped for those moments for you, even if they look nothing like mine, because we need each other in so many ways throughout the journeys of our life. And also, maybe if you look around at your sphere and you realize, oh no, like I've actually done harm, like I have been the rescuer, or at least I thought I was the rescuer. Be brave enough to be humble enough to say, there's actually a more influential, better way that involves less of me and my power and more of how I steward that for other people, like for themselves to take that and run with it, and just engage differently with the people you already know or maybe have harmed. And that takes a lot of courage, taking responsibility even for things. Maybe, people have a spectrum of experiences. Maybe our worst case scenarios, maybe more than anything, they just need to be accountable for. That takes bravery to do that. And so I just encourage people to look at what's already in their life, the ingredients that are already there, the relationships that are already there, and apply those principles there. And also just, I guess the last thing I would say is thank you. Like, thank you for being able to consider that opportunity and then actually get engaged in that way. I'm grateful for it. I know I've been the beneficiary of such bravery in my own life and career a lot. Like, I feel very grateful and like so lucky that I've had so much of that in my life. But thank you to everyone who's listening that thinks like, I will go do that.
Esther Garrett, we are grateful for your long friendship. So thank you.
Same. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.